Howard Zinn was born in New York City on August 24, 1922. His parents were Jewish immigrants and met as factory workers in the U.S. He was the oldest of three brothers. Growing up during the Depression, his family had had a hard life. Howard was the oldest of three brothers. Growing up during the Depression, his family had had a hard life. Howard's dad had many jobs, and the family had to frequently move from apartment to apartment to escape debtors and landlords. As an adult, Howard would talk about how hard his parents had to work and how little they ever had to show for it. Howard was the only one in his family that showed an interest in education. In fact, he was the only one of his brothers to have graduated from high school. Noticing his love for reading, his parents bought him a 20-volume set of Charles Dickens' complete works. Howard has credited Charles Dickens with stirring in him anger at arbitrary power and compassion for the poor. As a teenager, Howard was influenced by the books The Jungle and The Grapes of Wrath and books about fascism and with philosophers like Karl Marx. With a few like-minded friends, they even encouraged laundry workers in Brooklyn to organize a union. This sort of activism encouraged Howard to protest for workers' rights. In the summer of 1939, Howard was invited to a demonstration in Times Square. The protesters were orderly and nonviolent, but that changed when mounted police charged the demonstrators with clubs. Howard was hit and knocked unconscious. He describes this experience as a turning point. Quote, "I was no longer a liberal, a believer in the self-correcting character of American democracy. I was a radical, believing that something fundamental was wrong in this country, something rotten at the root." After graduating from Thomas Jefferson High School, Howard became an apprentice ship fitter in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. There, he and other apprentices were excluded from the skilled workers' unions. With other apprentices, he helped form a union called the Apprentice Association. In 1943, at the age of 21, Howard joined the Army Air Corps. While on leave, he met his future wife, Rosalind Schechter. Before going to Europe to fight in World War II, Howard and Rosalind married and stayed married until Howard's death in 2010. At the end of the war, Howard and Roz moved back to New York. They would have two children, Mila and Jeff. Rosalind took care of the children while Howard worked across various jobs. With the help of the GI Bill, he enrolled as a freshman in New York University at the age of 27. Howard would earn his BA degree and would earn his master's and doctoral degrees at Columbia University. After obtaining his doctoral degrees, Howard was offered the chairmanship of the History and Social Sciences Department at Spelman College in Atlanta. Spelman College was a historically Christian black women's college. At Spelman College, Howard encouraged his students to take a more active role in the civil rights movement by forming demonstrations, sit-ins, and challenging societies and the school's status quo. This activism and civil rights participation had created a wedge between Howard and the president of Spelman College, and in 1963, Howard was fired. Fast forward 40 years, and here is the current president of Spelman College honoring Howard at a banquet.
And it was Dr. Manley who fired Howard Zinn, a tenured history professor, as legend has it, for insubordination. Well, fast forward, so in 2004, there's a sociology professor at Spelman during my tenure, Professor Harry Lefevre, who wrote a book about Spelman women and the history of the civil rights movement called Undaunted by the Fight. And in the spring of 2004, Harry's book was published, and as part of the celebration of that, and also the 40th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, he invited Howard Zinn back to speak. And I was so excited, with my personal history, I was really excited to have this opportunity to hear Howard Zinn speak. And he came and said, this is the first time I have been here in 40 years. The first time since I was fired. And actually, it was as he told that story, it was the first time that I learned this particular piece of Spelman history, and decided then that we needed to clean that up. And so in spring, May 2005, we invited Marian Wright Edelman to be our commencement speaker, and we invited Howard Zinn to receive an honorary degree.
In his 7 years at Spelman College, Howard said they were probably the most interesting, exciting, most educational years for him. He learned more from his students than his students learned from him. In his time at Spelman College, Howard wrote 2 books pertaining to the civil rights movement: Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, The New Abolitionists, and The Southern Mystique. After teaching at Spelman College, Howard was offered a teaching position at Boston University teaching political science. While teaching, Howard was involved in the Vietnam anti-war protests. Howard would write about the Vietnam War and would also participate in some of the major demonstrations against the war. In 1965, Howard had spoken at a rally on the Boston Commons, which drew a very small crowd. In 1967, he addressed an anti-draft protest, also in the Boston Commons. He drew 4,000 to 5,000 people. Later that year, he took part in a massive demonstration in front of the Lincoln Memorial that drew 100,000 people. By then, polls showed roughly 50% of the country now thought the U.S. intervention in Vietnam was a mistake.
I think this also is part of our culture, I think, and that is a misguided notion of what patriotism is. I think we grow up in this country very often with the idea, which is inculcated from the beginning: you pledge allegiance to the flag and sing the Star-Spangled Banner and exalt military heroism. Grow up with the idea that to be patriotic means to support whatever the government does. And if you oppose the government, if you criticize the government, you're being unpatriotic. To think that way is a violation of basic democratic principles. The Declaration of Independence establishes the democratic principle. Governments are artificial creations. Governments are set up by the people to ensure certain rights: equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. When governments become destructive of those rights, that's what the Declaration of Independence says, it is the right of people to alter or abolish the government. If it's the right of people to alter or abolish the government, then certainly the right of people to criticize the government.
Howard would continue to teach at Boston University until his retirement in 1988. Along with being an activist in the Vietnam anti-war protest, Howard continued to write books and scholarly journals. His most successful and famous book was The People's History of the United States. Here he is discussing the role his wife had on writing the book.
There's certain crucial moments when she provoked me to write things that I wouldn't have written otherwise. And probably the best instance of that is A People's History of the United States, which is, I guess my most important book, not just because it's the fattest, but because it's, I guess it's better known than any of my other books. And I probably wouldn't have written it if not for my wife, who, when I was starting out and I was discouraged, I thought, who wants to write a history of the whole, country from going way back and down? I mean, too daunting a job. And, I'm not that ambitious or energetic. My wife said, no, you've got to do this.
Sold over 1 million copies.
It has sold over 1 million copies, but, over a year, it came out that's roughly since 1980, 81.
Howard wrote A People's History to present American history through the eyes of the common people, rather than political and economic elites. He wanted to fill in what standard texts either left out or skimmed over, like the perspectives of Native Americans, immigrants, slaves, and factory workers, and the many protests and struggles that had aimed at improving their lives.
A lot of pages in that book, 670 pages, and I'd hate to say that you can sum up my 670 pages in a paragraph, but I think it's true that the the point of that book is to tell the stories of ordinary people, of people who are overlooked in traditional histories. Because traditional histories generally deal with presidents and congresses and Supreme Court decisions, and when you read those traditional histories, what is implied is that these are the people, these important people are the ones who decide what is to be done, and your job is to watch them, or your job is to listen to them, or your job is to vote for them, which reduces your role as a citizen to going into the polling booths every 4 years or every 2 years. And what I'm saying in this book is, look, here is what ordinary people who are not presidents and who are not in Congress, here's what they were able to accomplish when the authorities were not able to. In fact, when the authorities were hostile to progress.
Over 2 million books of a people's history have been sold. The book was a runner-up in 1980 for the National Book Award. In 2003, Zinn was awarded the Prix d'Ami du Monde Diplomatique for the French version of this book.